Okay, let's dive into what is, no joke, one of the most revolutionary moments in all of human history. This is the story of how we went from, just being another animal out there to becoming the species that actively shapes the world around us. It's about how we completely changed our relationship with plants and animals forever.
And it really all kicks off with a question that sounds, well, kind of unbelievable when you think about it. How on earth did a wild, ferocious wolf become the loyal dog we know today? I mean, really think about that. The answer to that question? Well, it's the key to unlocking this massive shift in how we live.
So where does a story this big even begin? Well, it starts with the very first, really tentative steps humans took to kind of bridge that gap between our world and the wild. And this wasn't some sudden takeover, not at all. It was more like a slow, cautious dance.
I want you to just picture this for a second. You're an early human, living in a small camp, and you start leaving leftover food scraps nearby. A really simple act, right? But it wasn't just trash. It was an invitation. And you know who was the very first animal to accept that invitation? The wild ancestor of the dog.
And see, this wasn't about just capturing animals. It was all about building trust step by step. First, you've got the food invitation. Then you start to encourage the less aggressive, gentler animals to hang around. And here's the crucial part. Humans started protecting these animals from other predators. I mean, think about that shift in mindset. You go from being a hunter to a protector. And that final step, where you're actively managing the group, well, that's how we became herders.
So, this whole process of taming animals, not just dogs, but now sheep, goats, and cattle, it turned out to be the spark for something way, way bigger. We're talking about a full-blown revolution that was about to change the entire course of human civilization.
And just to put a pin in a timeline, we're talking about a transformation that got started roughly 12,000 years ago. Just let that sink in. Almost everything you and I eat today, every plant, every animal product, is a direct result of a process that our distant ancestors kicked off all that time ago.
So what exactly is domestication? Because it's actually more than just taming a single animal. It's an active, super intentional process. This is the moment when we stopped just, taking whatever nature gave us and started to make choices. We began to select specific plants and animals to breed because they had certain traits that we found useful.
And you can literally see the results of this process right here. Take a look. On one side, you've got the teeth of a wild pig, and on the other, a domesticated one. The difference is pretty clear, right? Over generations of us choosing the more manageable animals, their physical traits actually changed. The teeth and horns of domesticated animals got way, way smaller than their wild ancestors.
So this is the really crucial takeaway here. This wasn't just about changing an animal's behavior. We were physically reshaping other species. A domesticated cow today is biologically different from its wild ancestor, the auroch. And it's the same for plants. A stalk of modern wheat is just different from its wild grassy cousin.
Which leads to this pretty powerful idea, right? These early farmers, they were basically the world's first genetic engineers. I mean, they didn't have fancy labs or anything, but with nothing more than careful observation and a whole lot of patience, they started to consciously design the living world around them.
And when it came to plants, the process was surprisingly methodical. You can just imagine a farmer asking, okay, does this one give me big, fat grains? Is its stalk strong enough to not fall over before I can harvest it? And can it fight off disease? They would save seeds only from the plants that checked all the right boxes. Only the best of the best got to be part of the next season's crop.
Now, for animals, the most important thing was actually pretty simple, but it was absolutely essential. I mean, think about it. You probably don't want a giant, aggressive bull running around your village. What you want are animals that are relatively gentle, ones you can actually manage. So a calm temperament, that was, without a doubt, the #1 trait they were looking for. So who were the first big successes in this brand new world? Well, on the plant side, you had wheat and barley. And for animals, it was sheep and goats. These four became the absolute foundation of early agriculture. You could even call them the cornerstones of this whole new way of life. Okay, so having a stable food source from farming and herding, this did way more than just change our diets. It completely blew up the old human way of life. Everything was about to change. This really was a massive fork in the road for humanity. Before this, we were hunter-gatherers, right? Always on the move, following the food. But farming demands that you stay in one place to take care of your crops and animals. So for the first time ever, we started putting down roots, literally.
But this new, settled lifestyle created a brand new problem. A good problem, but a problem nonetheless. For the first time, people had extra food, a surplus. A great harvest of grain had to last you all the way until the next one. So, the new question became, how do we store all this stuff safely?
And you know what they say, necessity is the mother of invention. People started making clay pots and weaving baskets. This was a huge technological leap, and it was driven entirely by this new need to manage their food surplus. All of a sudden, you could store grain for the winter, and you could use these new pots to cook completely different kinds of meals.
So you might be wondering, how in the world do we know all this stuff happened so long ago? Well, the story is basically written in the ground right under our feet. We're just following the clues, the echoes left behind by these very first farmers and herders.
Archaeologists are constantly finding the hard evidence. At sites all across the subcontinent, they're digging up the actual remains, burnt grains, and the bones of domesticated animals. What this table is really showing us isn't just a list of places, it's a pattern. It proves this farming revolution wasn't just some one-off thing. It was a whole new way of life that was spreading far and wide.
And it wasn't just about the food. The tools themselves changed. You could say the Stone Age got a serious upgrade. These tools here are from the Neolithic period, and you can see they have these polished, really fine cutting edges. And why is that? Simple. They were designed for brand new jobs, like clearing land and harvesting crops. It just goes to show you, form follows function, even 12,000 years ago.
But maybe the most fascinating thing of all is how this whole domestication thing changed our culture, even what we believe. At a site in a place called Mehrgarh, archaeologists found this burial. It's a person buried with several goats. And the most likely reason for this? Those goats were probably meant to be a food source for that person in the next world. Our new relationship with animals had become so deep, it was now part of our ideas about the afterlife.
So this incredible revolution, which all started with something as simple as leaving some food out for a wild animal, it completely remade human society. It gave us permanent homes, new technologies, even new beliefs. And so the final thought I want to leave you with is this. The next time you sit down to eat, just take a second and look at your plate. And ask yourself, how many of the choices made by those very first farmers all the way back 12,000 years ago are still shaping the food you're about to eat right now?
Today, we're diving into one of the biggest turning points in all of human history. I'm talking about the incredible revolution that took us from constantly chasing our food to growing it, right outside our front door.
Just think about that for a second. Really imagine it. No fridge, no grocery stores, nothing. Just that constant, daily uncertainty of finding enough food just to make it through the day.
You know, for most of our time on this planet, that was the reality for every single human, living on the edge. But then, about 12,000 years ago, this revolutionary idea started to take root, and it would completely reshape our world.
So what was this incredible idea? Well, it wasn't just about finding food anymore. It was about controlling the food supply. It was about, for the first time, taming the wild world around us.
And there's a word for this, of course, domestication. It's a simple idea, really. It's the moment we started to intentionally grow certain plants and raise specific animals. A slow, gradual process that kicked off a whole new era for humanity.
And you have to understand, this wasn't an accident. Nope. These early people basically became the world's first genetic engineers. They weren't just grabbing any old seed. They were carefully picking seeds from the plants that were toughest, the ones with the biggest grains, the ones with stalks strong enough not to break. And it was the same deal with animals. They chose the calmest, most gentle ones to breed.
And you can actually see the result of all this. I mean, look at this. Over generations of that selective breeding, the teeth of domesticated animals literally got smaller than their wild ancestors. It's incredible. The evidence of this massive change is etched right into their bones.
Now, being able to produce your own food had this huge consequence, one they probably didn't even see coming. For the first time ever, humans stopped wandering and started staying put. It's honestly mind-blowing when you think about it. The entire foundation of our world today, our homes, our cities, everything, it all started with something as tiny and simple as a single grain of wheat or barley.
Because the moment you plant that seed, you're locked in. You can't just pack up and leave. You're committed. You have to stick around for weeks, then months, watering it, pulling up weeds, chasing away birds. It's this long-term investment that physically ties you to one piece of land.
And that's the whole ballgame, right there. The nomadic life that had defined humanity for millions of years was over. Farming anchored people to one spot, and that changed everything about the human experience.
Okay, but staying in one place creates a brand new problem. You have this massive harvest, which is great, but what do you do with all of it? How do you make sure it lasts through the winter? You have to figure out storage.
And this challenge led to another explosion of creativity. People started crafting huge clay pots to keep their grains safe and dry. They wove these amazing massive baskets. And in some places, they even dug pits right into the ground, creating these ancient underground silos to keep their precious harvests safe for the lean months, or to use as seeds for the next crop.
At the exact same time, herders came up with a totally different but just as brilliant solution for storage. And this solution was alive. It could walk. They started to look at their herds not as a single meal, but as a living, breathing pantry.
I mean, think about how perfect this is. Animals were the ultimate living larder. Why? Well, for one, they make more of themselves, so your food supply literally grows on its own. They also give you a steady supply of milk, and, most importantly, they offer you meat on demand whenever you need it. It's a reliable, self-refreshing food source. Genius.
So this all sounds like a pretty good story, right? But how do we actually know any of this really happened? Well, the clues are literally buried right under our feet, just waiting to be found.
This is where archaeologists come in. They're basically detectives for the past. They spend years painstakingly excavating these ancient sites, piecing together the story of these first farmers from the tiniest clues left behind.
And the stuff they find is just wow. Look at this. In places like Mehrgarh, they found the charred remains of wheat and barley right next to the bones of sheep and goats. Then, way up in Burzahom, in Kashmir, they found wheat and lentils and cattle bones. Every little find is another piece of the puzzle, telling us exactly who lived there and what they were eating.
And it's not just food they find. It's the tech that made this new life possible. These aren't the old rough tools from earlier times. No way. These are new and improved, polished stone tools with a super fine cutting edge. And look here, mortars and pestles, a tool designed for one specific tough job, grinding all that grain into flour. A piece of tech so perfect, we still use the basic idea today.
But, maybe the most powerful clues of all are the ones that hint at what these people believed. At that same site, Mehrgarh, archaeologists found several burials. And in this one, a person was buried with the skeletons of several goats. I mean, why would you do that?
The most likely answer is just incredibly moving. The goats were probably provisions, food for the journey into the next world. This one grave tells us so much. It shows us these early people weren't just thinking about the next harvest. They were thinking about what comes after life itself. So, there's no question that this agricultural revolution gave us food security, and that led to villages and eventually to the cities we live in today. But you have to wonder, what did we lose? In exchange for all this, we got backbreaking labor, new diseases, and a much less varied diet. In gaining the world we know, what parts of our freer, wandering past did we give up for good?
So we've talked about how farming changed everything, right? But the real story, the truly revolutionary part, is what happened after that. I mean, once you stop wandering around, you have to actually learn how to, well, live in one spot. So let's dive into this incredible chain reaction of innovations in housing, tools, all of it, that basically laid out the blueprint for the way we live today, all the way back in the Neolithic age. And yeah, it really all kicks off right here. You see, farming wasn't just about having a new source of food. It was a complete, radical shift in how we related to the world around us. For the very first time in our history, people had to stay put. Not for a few days, but for months, maybe even years, just waiting for those crops to grow. Humanity was putting down roots, and I mean that literally. So that brings us to the big question, right? What happens when you stop wandering and actually start building a life in one place? Suddenly, you've got this whole new set of challenges, but also a ton of new opportunities. I mean, how do you even build a permanent home? What kind of new tools are you going to need? This whole explainer is really a story about human ingenuity and how we started answering those exact questions. Okay, so first things first, if you're going to stay in one place, you need a real home. Those temporary shelters that worked great for hunter-gatherers, yeah, those just aren't going to cut it anymore. You need something permanent, something solid that can actually get you through the changing seasons. So what was their solution? Well, in colder places like Burzahom, which is in modern-day Kashmir, archaeologists found this absolutely brilliant idea. Instead of building up, people started digging down. They created these incredible dwellings that we now call pit houses. And what's so cool about these is just how practical they were. I mean, think about it. By digging into the ground, you're using the earth itself as natural insulation to protect you from the cold. So smart. Archaeologists found steps leading right down into them, and get this, cooking hearths were found both inside and outside. It just shows you how flexible they were. You know, if it was cold or rainy, no problem, cook inside. But if it was a beautiful day, cook outside. It's so simple, but just incredibly clever. All right, so you've got a permanent home, check. But now, what about all that grain you're growing? See, harvesting it is just the first step. Turning those hard little kernels into something you can actually eat, that's a whole new challenge. And it's one that required a major upgrade in technology. And this right here is where we see a huge leap forward. You know, the tools from the old Stone Age, the Paleolithic, they were basically made by just chipping away at a rock. I mean, they worked, but they were pretty rough. Neolithic tools, on the other hand, were often polished. And that whole process created a way finer, much sharper, and way more durable cutting edge. It was just perfect for all the new jobs they had to do. And just look at the results. These things aren't just random rocks. They are specialized pieces of ancient tech. You can really see those smooth, polished surfaces. These tools were engineered for a very specific job, to process all that food they were growing, which had now become the absolute center of their entire world. And probably the most important of these new tools were mortars and pestles. Super simple concept, right? You've got the mortar, that's the bowl part, and then the pestle, which is the heavy grinder thing. This basic combo was an absolute game changer. This was the piece of tech that unlocked all the nutrition packed inside those grains, turning hard seeds you couldn't eat into flour. And get this. This technology was so good, so effective, that we're still using it today. Seriously, thousands of years later, you'll find mortars and pestles in kitchens all over the world. That is an incredible, direct link from our Neolithic ancestors straight to us.
And hey, the innovation wasn't just happening with stone. People were super resourceful. Archaeologists have found tons of tools from this time that were carefully crafted out of animal bone, too.
So, okay, let's recap. We've got permanent homes and we've got better tools. Life is starting to get way more stable. And that stability, it gives you a new gift. Time. Suddenly, there's time to think, time for new ideas, and time for new crafts to really take off. Which, of course, leads to the next problem you've got to solve. When you have a good harvest, you get a lot of grain, way more than you can eat in one sitting. So how do you store it so it doesn't go bad? And after you grind it into flour, how do you cook it? It's not like you can just toss flour into a fire, right? The answer was another absolute game changer: pottery. People figured out that if you shape clay and then bake it or fire it, you can create the world's first ever reliable containers. These simple earthen pots were the perfect solution for both storing your food and cooking it. Now, this is so crucial to understand. Pottery wasn't just a bucket. It was a full-on kitchen revolution. For one, it let people store grain and keep it safe from pests and dampness. But maybe even more important, it meant they could finally boil water. They could cook things like rice and wheat and lentils. This unlocked a whole new universe of nutrition, and it's what really made these grains the staples they are today. And you can even see from some of the decorated pots they found, people were already making their everyday items beautiful. They were bringing art into their lives. And the creative boom just kept going. Farming also introduced brand new plants, like cotton. So with this more settled life, people finally had the time, and now the right materials, to figure out another amazing new skill: weaving cloth. Okay, so let's just step back and look at the whole picture. You can really see how it's all one big chain reaction, this amazing cascade of innovation. It all starts with farming. That forces you into a settled life. That settled life means you need permanent homes, like those pit houses. The farming itself demands new tools, like polished grinders. And finally, all that stability gives you the breathing room for totally new crafts, like pottery and weaving. It's wild. One single change, just the simple act of planting a seed, literally set everything else in motion. So when you really think about it, the Neolithic Revolution wasn't just about what people were eating. It was about inventing the entire idea of home, a stable place with specialized tools, with storage, with comforts. And that really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the big innovations happening today that are completely changing how and where we live our lives? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for diving into this with me. We often think of the agricultural revolution as being all about food, right? But what if I told you it wasn't just about what we ate, but about how we learned to live together? It completely rewired, well, everything. So let's get into it. Yeah, that's really the big question we're tackling here. How did this simple act of putting a seed in the ground teach us how to be a community? We're going to trace it all back, right to the roots of how our first villages and societies even came to be. Okay, so picture this. For almost all of human history, we were constantly on the move. Nomads, right? But then you plant a seed, and suddenly you're making a commitment. You can't just wander off. You have to stay put for weeks, months, maybe even years to take care of those plants and wait for the harvest. I mean, that is a radical shift in thinking. And then after all that waiting, you've got a harvest. But now you have a new problem. You can't just pack up all that grain and carry it with you. It had to be stored. It had to be protected. Because that grain wasn't just food, right? It was also the seeds for next year's crop. It was a whole new kind of wealth. And that meant people had to figure out how to stay put and manage it all. So how do we know all this? Well, this new settled life left behind clues. Tons of them. And archaeologists have been piecing this puzzle together for years. We can literally see the evidence of people putting down roots and building a permanent world for the very first time. So, gone are the days of temporary shelters you could pack up and move. People started building permanent homes. In places like Burzahom, in what's now Kashmir, people actually dug these cool pit houses right into the ground with steps leading down. This wasn't just a place to crash for the night. This was a home base, the center of their entire world, built to last. And you know what happens when you stay in one place? You start inventing stuff. This settled life led to this incredible burst of innovation. You get these amazing earthen pots, which were absolutely essential for storing grain and, for the first time, cooking things like rice and wheat. And look at the tools. They weren't just rough rocks anymore. They were polished to have these super fine cutting edges, totally perfect for all the new jobs that came with farming. But here's the thing. All these physical changes, the houses, the pots, the fields, they created a brand new challenge. Okay, so we're all living together now. How do we actually do that? How do you organize a whole bunch of people who aren't just a small wandering band anymore? You need a new social structure, a new set of rules. And the solution our ancestors came up with? The tribe. You can think of it like the social software that ran on the new hardware of agriculture. It was the blueprint for how to live together, work together, and, thrive in one place. So, what are we talking about when we say tribe? Well, at its core, it's basically a big extended family network. We're talking 2 or 3 generations, grandparents, parents, kids, all living together in these little settlements or villages. This whole structure provided both the support and the organization that a community needs to survive. Okay, let's zoom in a bit and look at the daily grind. What was life actually like? Well, in a tribe, everybody had a part to play. Seriously, survival depended on this super clear and cooperative system where every single person's contribution was absolutely vital. And the way they divided up the work is fascinating. Women, for instance, typically handled most of the heavy agricultural lifting, prepping the ground, sowing the seeds, harvesting, and processing all that grain. Men often took the big herds of animals out to find pasture. Even the kids had jobs, like chasing birds and animals away from the plants. And then a lot of the most important tasks, like milking animals, making tools and huts, and even singing and dancing, were done by everyone together. It was a real team effort through and through. But, a tribe was so much more than just a well-organized work crew. The real social glue, the thing that truly held these communities together, was a deep, shared sense of identity and a completely different way of thinking about wealth and who owned what. I mean, every tribe had its own rich, unique culture. They had their own languages, their own music, stories, and art. They had their own gods and goddesses they worshipped. And think about this. Leadership wasn't about who had the most stuff. It was about wisdom and experience. So elders, brave warriors, and priests, they were the ones who were really held in high regard. And this next part, this is probably one of the most important things to understand. Think about the most valuable resources: the land, the forests, the grasslands, the water. In these tribes, those things weren't owned by any one person. They were seen as the wealth of the entire tribe. Everybody shared them, and everybody used them together. Just let that sink in for a moment. And what happens when you think that way? The result is pretty profound. When your most important wealth is shared by everyone, Well, you just don't get those sharp divisions between the rich and the poor. The whole society was built around cooperation, not competition for who could hoard the most resources. We can even see hints of these shared beliefs in the way they honored their dead. At sites like Mehrgarh, archaeologists found burial sites where people were buried with special items, including animals like goats. The thinking is these were probably meant as food for the next world. This shows us they had a common faith, shared rituals that bonded the community together, not just in life, but even in their beliefs about death. So you have to understand, this new tribal way of life wasn't just some small, isolated experiment happening in a corner of the world. No way. This was a full-blown revolution that swept across the subcontinent and really across the globe, completely changing the course of human history forever. And we have the proof. Just look at the archaeological finds from all over the subcontinent, from Mehrgarh in modern-day Pakistan, where they found wheat, barley, and cattle, all the way to Chirand in Bihar with its wheat and buffalo. The pattern is crystal clear. This was the new blueprint for living, and it was popping up everywhere. Which kind of brings us full circle and leaves us with a pretty big thought. These first communities, our very first societies, were built on these incredible principles of shared resources and working together. So as we look at our own world today, it kind of makes you wonder, right? In the thousands of years since, in our journey from those first tribes to our massive modern societies, what have we gained? And what might we have lost along the way? You know, for most of human history, we didn't have a permanent home. We were always on the move. But then, somewhere along the line, everything changed. Today, we're going to dig deep into the past and unearth the stories of the very first villages. What secrets are these ancient stones holding about that exact moment our ancestors decided to just stay put? Well, let's find out. For thousands and thousands of years, humanity was nomadic. But then, this revolutionary shift happened. People started to settle down. They started building homes, farming the land, and raising animals. And you know, this wasn't just a change in lifestyle. This was the birth of community as we know it. So what did this massive transformation from wandering to settling actually look like on the ground? All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll dig into the big idea that made villages even possible. Then, we're off to a site called Mehrgarh to meet some of the very first farmers. After that, we'll travel east to Daujali Hading for some pretty surprising clues. And finally, we'll zoom way out to a place called Catalhuyuk to see just how connected this ancient world really was. Okay, so before we start digging at any of these amazing sites, we really have to get our heads around the one big idea that made all of this happen. See, it wasn't just about building a house. It was about building a future in one single spot. And that required a whole new relationship with the world around them. And that new relationship was built on one incredibly powerful idea: domestication. About 12,000 years ago, our ancestors basically became the world's first genetic engineers. They weren't just taking whatever nature threw at them anymore. Nope, they were actively shaping it, choosing the best seeds to replant, the calmest animals to breed. It was this slow, careful process that really laid the foundation for, well, everything that came next. And you can literally see the proof right in the bones. I mean, just look at the teeth of a wild pig compared to its domesticated descendant. The change is pretty dramatic, right? Living under human protection, with a steady supply of food, the animals themselves physically changed over generations. This was so much more than just taming a wild animal. It was about fundamentally remaking it. All right, let's head to our first stop, Mehrgarh. It's located in this fertile plain near the Bolan Pass in modern-day Pakistan. And this place, it is so important because it's one of the earliest villages we know of, giving us this incredible, precious window into the lives of some of the world's very first farmers. So what did archaeologists find when they started digging? Well, they uncovered the charred remains of barley and wheat. That's the smoking gun for early farming. And right alongside them, they found the bones of sheep, goats, and a bit later, cattle. It paints this amazing picture of a community that had figured out both farming and herding. They weren't just surviving day to day, they were planning for the future. And of course, they built permanent homes to protect that future. What you're seeing here is a reconstruction of a house from Mehrgarh. They were usually square or rectangular and divided up into 4 or more compartments. It's pretty likely that some of these rooms were for living, while others were basically ancient pantries, used to store all that precious grain they were harvesting. But Mehrgarh shows us more than just how people lived. It gives us a glimpse into what they believed. Archaeologists found burial sites that point to a really deep respect for the dead. In one incredible find, a person was laid to rest with several goats. And get this, it wasn't a random act. It really suggests they believed in an afterlife and that these animals were meant to be food for the journey beyond this world. Okay, time to pack our bags and move on. We're traveling east now to Darjeeling, a site tucked away in the hills near the Brahmaputra Valley. Now, its location is absolutely key here. It's super close to ancient routes that lead into what we now call China and Myanmar. And that placement, well, it tells a really fascinating story. The clues here are a little different. Yeah, they found stone tools, but the really big deal discoveries are mortars and pestles. Finding these heavy-duty grinding tools, that's a massive clue. It means these folks weren't just gathering grain, they were processing it, probably grinding it into flour. We also see early pottery, which is perfect for storage, and even some tools made from ancient fossilized wood. But there was one find that just changes the whole picture. Jadeite. This beautiful green stone isn't from anywhere near this site. So, where did it come from? The best guess is that it was brought all the way from China. This one stone just shatters the idea of these people living in some isolated little village. Instead, it shows us they were a part of a huge ancient network. And you know, this idea of an ancient connected world, it wasn't just happening at Darjeeling. To really understand how massive these networks were, we have to travel west to one of the most famous prehistoric sites on the entire planet, Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey. The stuff they found at Çatalhöyük is just mind-boggling. Seriously, we are talking about flint for making tools that was imported all the way from Syria, beautiful cowrie shells that were brought from the Red Sea, hundreds of miles away, and other shells from the Mediterranean. This was not your local flea market. This was an international supply chain, stretching for hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles. And here's the part that is just absolutely astonishing. They built this huge trade network before the invention of the wheel. Think about that. No carts. Everything, the flint, the shells, the jadeite, it all had to be carried on the backs of pack animals or literally by people walking across these enormous distances. So let's just step back and trace this incredible journey. It all starts when people finally settle down, when they learn to farm and herd in one place, like we saw at Mehrgarh. Then they develop new tools to support this new life, like the mortars and pestles from Darjeeling. And finally, these settled communities start building connections, creating these massive trade networks that spanned continents, long before what we typically think of as civilization. The evidence is pretty clear. The ancient world was so much more connected than we ever imagined. And it really makes you wonder, right? If our ancestors were building these incredible networks without even having the wheel, what other amazing stories of their ingenuity and their connections are still lying buried right under our feet, just waiting to be discovered? Thanks so much for joining me on this expedition.